On today's World Insight, big gains for the European Union's far-right parties in recent parliamentary elections as the European People's Party keeps its lead. What does the shift to the political right mean for EU heavyweights France and Germany? How could the election outcome affect the EU's domestic and foreign policies?
Hello and welcome to World Insight with me, Tian Wei. The center-right European People's Party, or EPP, has gained a decisive victory in the 2024 European Parliament election. The results show a shift, with centrist parties losing seats and far-right groups making big gains, some say. The vote results also raise questions over how the EU's major powers, France and Germany, for example, can drive policy in the bloc. In France, the National Rally Party's win prompted French President Emmanuel Macron to dissolve the National Assembly and call for snap parliamentary elections in the coming weeks. So, what are the potential of repercussions these results will have on European politics and foreign policy? Why are far-right groups, as some say, apparently becoming more mainstream? For deeper insights, let's loop in our panelists. I'm glad to be joined in Berlin, Ulrich Bruckner, Jean Monnet Professor for European Studies with Stanford University. In Paris, Joab Toker, Professor at the American Graduate School in Paris. In Beijing, Rong Ying, Senior Research Fellow from the China Institute of International Studies. Gentlemen, welcome to the program. This is a big event going on in Europe with more than a dozen countries, EU members, participating. Now, I want to have a brief round of takeaways from you about the results. Let's start with Professor Bruckner.
We usually look at the European Parliament as election of secondary order. The European Union is not a state, and so the member states still matter more than the supranational architecture in which the European Parliament didn't even exist when it was founded. So every 5 years since 1979, we elect people that most voters don't personally know because they don't quite understand how decision-making in the European Union works. And that also led to a lower voter turnout. This time, we had for the first time a situation in which Euroscepticism was not about how can we improve what the European Union is doing, but we had a large number of parties that tell a story that the European Union is not the solution, it's the problem. And this was actually a true choice and not, I wanted a little bit more social or a little bit more green, but it's a fundamental question about shall we end the European integration process and go back to a power play of sovereign states.
Very interesting.
And the vast majority of people voted in favor of let's continue.
Professor Toker.
Well, I would say that there are two major insights. 48 hours or so after the 27 countries members of the EU have voted. The first insight, which is sort of stable and established, is the uncontestable progress of populist, rather extreme right movements throughout the continent, with practically no exceptions. They have all become more powerful, and they have become dramatically more powerful in 2 or 3 major countries. Now, the second insight is less clear to define at this moment, because we're speaking about internal political ramifications due to the European vote. And this is mainly relevant in our overall perspective regarding the 2 major superpowers of the EU, namely Germany and France. In both of them, the ruling structures, the political systems are not equal, so it's somehow difficult to compare frontally. But the 2 ruling configurations have been greatly weakened. In such an unclear, weakened political situation, we have so many question marks all over the Union, not just proper to Germany and France alone.
I want to have our European guest once again to shed some light on the exact power, it seems that this parliamentary election indicates about the extreme right, the far right, and the central right, as they say, in terms of their power shift or not?
We have 720 members of parliament in the European Parliament. And before the elections, like the result in 2019, we had a bit more than 100 representing two-party groups that represent the far right. Now it could be that they double to 200, which means that we still have more than 500 members of parliament that represent the European Union is a solution. There is no distinction between coalitions that support a government and opposition, what we usually look at Western-type parliaments, because there is no government. So the role play of the European Parliament is a different one compared with other Western-type governmental systems that distinguish between executive and legislation. That makes it a bit more confusing, but this landslide victory of right-wing groups is in fact in Germany from 10% to 15%, which doesn't really look like landslide.
Professor Tucker.
The central power and the meaningful majority within this new parliament will not be dramatically altered by the results of last week's election. Namely, the right and center-right major coalitions will still have a rather clear majority and will be able to pass resolutions regarding the overall EU policies. This is not true regarding the internal situations in many countries, and as I said before, mainly the major members of the EU, namely Germany and France.
Now let's go to Mr. Rong Ying, based in Beijing. This parliamentary election, as both our guests articulated, was not necessarily on the watch list of everyone, let's just say years ago. And now everyone in the world is watching so closely about this result and what this result might mean for politics, particularly in some major European countries. Observing from afar, Mr. Rong, your takeaway.
I would say that a lot of Chinese will be very much familiar with the EU Commission, EU Council, but I think they may not very well understand the functioning, the structure of European Parliament, or even for those who know about this structure, I think they are not very well impressed by what the role of European Parliament has played. Because you follow the reports, you will find that what is happening, the anti-China resolutions and others, and the difficulties and the problems like that. But for this moment, for this development, I think what Chinese viewers, Chinese analysts will be interesting is, of course, that the indication of the political landscape, political dynamic that has been represented by the change, and what it would mean for the politics of a particular country, for example, France, Germany, and other European countries, Italy and others.
Germany did not, like France, call for immediate parliamentary election as a result of the EU Parliament election. But this certainly will have an impact on the German politics, on the policies and directions of the current cabinet, for example. What is your take on its possible impacts?
Well, it is not such a normal procedure to immediately react to a European parliamentary result and make it look like, oh, this is a game changer for domestic politics. So a lot of people who used to focus on, is the European Union functional as a consequence of the elections, were taken by surprise that we immediately have discussions about snap elections in Germany too. Because if you look at the position of the party of the chancellor, they won 15%. 15. This doesn't really look like people are very satisfied with the way the chancellor is guiding the country and which role he plays on European level. So I couldn't agree more to what my French colleague is discussing, the consequences of this. On a European level, the EU is perfectly fine and functioning. There will be a re-election, most likely, of Ursula von der Leyen, but domestically, the German coalition that is currently in power is massively under pressure. And that was something not many people predicted before the elections.
Politicians of different parties are becoming active again under the current circumstances with the latest result of the European Parliament election. A lot of them see themselves and others of the same party could have a better chance. There's also the opportunity for them to communicate more with the public and with the relevant stakeholders. So how do you see these kinds of, in a way, political chemical shake-up would have on the politics in Germany, for example, where you are most familiar with, Professor Bruckner?
There's a different attitude towards climate change. There's a different attitude towards immigration policy. And 20% of the German voters voted in favor of parties that are skeptical about the German position to support Ukraine in their struggle against the full-fledged invasion of Russia against a neighboring country. So this is a concerning number, but the overall picture is Germany still stands united in positions towards the European Union. And even if there are snap elections, a majority would vote in favor of parties that fully support the Western alliance in their support for Ukraine.
I see. Professor Tolker, let's go to you. The calling for snap parliamentary election, that was being said by analysts as a surprise for many. How would you understand the mentality of the French president at this moment, and he insists on having the prime minister to stay, meanwhile to see through the next parliamentary election in France? Tell us more about the articulation you have about the latest situation.
Yeah, okay. First of all, at the outset, one should emphasize that the political system, a presidential political system in France, is different. Actually, France is the exception. Practically all the other governments in the EU have a coalition system and does not have a presidential system. Namely, the president is not the number one person, decision maker on the top of the pyramid. This is clearly and very much so the case in France. So everything centers around the personality and the politics of the man, Emmanuel Macron, the president. So he indeed surprised practically everybody in this decision for snap elections. And of course, we really do not know what these snap elections in about 3 weeks from now, in 2 rounds, what kind of political majority, if any, will be born during those 2 rounds. So no clear answer. We have to wait until the beginning of July, see what kind of new parliament enters the Palais Bourbon, is the name of the palace in which parliament is located, and then see to what extent is President Macron becoming a minor player on top of the pyramid, but a minor player in French politics, or will he succeed to arrange for some kind of coalition which will enable him to stay active in spite of the large weakness of his camp?
Another question, which is related to the fanfare of the reading of the result of the parliamentary election this time. Of course, things are very different now compared to, let's just say, 10 years ago, when people are looking at the importance and significance given the latest event about the European Parliament. But one might also wonder, in a time of geopolitics and global fragmentation, rhetorics are being created for different political advantages. And therefore, realistically speaking, how do you see the rhetorics related to the reading now all over the world about the European Parliament election, especially that its result is only having an indirect impact on the national politics, including so-called bigger and smaller nations.
I think we are taking into a broader context what is happening in the other part of the world. We are very much following closely what is happening in the United States, and certainly I think in after November, what would be coming up. We're also following up what is happening in UK, in London. The election is around the corner. After this parliamentary election, we're having snap election in Paris, in France, and possibly in Germany. So what, again, interesting Chinese viewers is the approach that they are managing these problems, the challenges, and what would be the direction that they are, politically, economically, and of course, most consequently, I think their impact on their relationship with China.
I see.
And more importantly, I think as the world is now entering, facing so many challenges, turbulences, volatilities, China believes that Europe, EU, is a major partner for managing these challenges, and a major partner for cooperation in a cooperative way. That is the message I think China sent very clear and repeatedly when President Xi last month visiting Europe. And China is looking forward to kind of a leadership, the kind of the wisdom, and certainly kind of, I think, political sort of courage would be exercised by the leadership, but also I see European voters.
Okay, go to both of you, Professor Toker in Paris, please.
Our colleague in Beijing mentioned the American elections in November and the possibility of a new president entering office in January, namely in about 8 months from now. Watch for it over the coming month. The British are most probably going to have a new government. The French, we don't know, but it's all going to happen in about 4 weeks from now. And we're going to have between now and November or January an overall situation in the Western world in which expectations for either new or renewed or differently renewed political systems are in power. Now, we know in political science, in theory and practice, that electoral periods are prosperous for both contradictory things, either for relative lack of important decisions because different governments are waiting for people to vote and the political line to emerge on one hand. On the other hand, on higher risks or possibilities or opportunities for sort of capricious political decisions which leaders may take because of the electoral pressure which is on them during the situation, due to the situation in their own countries. So these two extreme situations may express themselves over the coming 6 to 8 months to come in the European context and well above.
Well, the European Union doesn't have a designated leader that guides us into a certain direction, but it's a much more decentralized system if we compare it with China or even a member state of the European Union. So this idea of a French-German leadership or the beginning of the process by reconciliation between former enemies was an explanatory model for a long time. But since eastward enlargement, it's no longer a given that what the Germans and the French find rational finds applause in Hungary, in Poland, or in Northern Europe. So what we will see now is if Germany and France are both weakened as potential leaders, others will step in. It doesn't mean necessarily that that is a vacuum. This could even lead to a situation in which we are not dependent on Germany and France as the natural-born leaders in the European Union, but other countries step in that have been strengthened through the elections, or the leaders of the European institutions, like the president of the Commission, could take a lead, who presented the European Union as a future geostrategic leader to redefine its relations with the United States and China.
There are several issues I think the Chinese would have in mind. One is, China's relations, quote unquote, with the West, including, of course, many of the European countries. Two, some of the trade and economic issues such as EVs and etc. Three, cooperation possibilities. Earlier, there was great potential on green development and energy transition, and whether these potentials still exist or to what degree. Fourth, the understanding and also exchanges between the peoples from both sides, from China and from European countries, how much people would devote to mutual understanding. So, Mr. Rong, given that context, how do you see China can be better communicating, even at this uncertain time, with our European counterparts?
That's a great question. Certainly, I think what is happening in Europe will be very much impact China. And even though I think China has made it very clear that it regards Europe as a major force for multipolarity, and it is ready to work very closely, collaboratively with Europe, as always, to pursue world and to managing challenges ahead. Having said that, I think China also, by reaching out, by communicating directly at the political level, as we have seen the visits by President Xi, and also at the levels of, at the people like us, what we are happening, are very much important to achieve better understanding on a mutually respect basis. This is exactly, I think, the conversation like that is important. And equally important is that we need to resume and step up communications at people-to-people level. And China has made efforts by, putting forward some proposals and actually policies for visa simplification or visa exemptions, and it has been very well responded. And I think China would like continue to along that line. And last but not least, China is ready to work with, as far as I can see, with Europe, and that to find a way to address the common challenges and the respective challenges facing us.
Professor Toker, tell me more about your thoughts. Of course, national politics usually in every country comes first. China is not the top of the agenda, but only when it comes to international relations, international trade. But also there were tendencies that China could fall into a scapegoat by some politics. So from your perspective, how do you see the rational way of resolve the differences and also begin real quality communications and seeking for solutions for some of the common challenges?
Through this perspective that you proposed and our colleague in Beijing had developed, my modest analysis would be that through a Chinese point of view, actually this relative weakening of European institutions, this more than relative weakening of the famous German-French couple, to be rather profitable, so to speak, through Chinese perspective. We know that China had both officially and unofficially favored rather bilateral relations with different European countries, small ones and big ones, rather than dealing with the EU as a bloc, which is not, by the way, and this is due to the fact that the EU lacks coherent foreign and defense policies.
I'm not sure it is the right answer or right interpretation as far as I can see. China always, I think, see Europe as a whole and want to see united Europe, a successful Europe, because the EU represents, as I said, a major force for multipolarity. And of course, in reality, China would have to deal with individual countries and in the meantime, deal with, I think, the institutions as it is.
Professor Bruckner, as you may know, this is a very interesting subject also for many in China interested in international relations today. So how will the issue of China, European capitals, bilateral relations, and also China-EU relations come into the overall discussion about today's EU parliamentary election and the future impacts on different politics?
Well, first of all, I don't see the elections being a result that weakens EU institutions. The parliament is perfectly functional, and there will be a strong European Commission president. What is weakened is the composition of the bodies of the member states, because some governments get under pressure, and that makes it hard to predict in what direction this body that usually defines the guidelines of the European Union's orientation, how they are thinking. And they reflect discourses in the different societies in which the thinking about dependencies has changed a lot with the Russian invasion in Ukraine, because we learned that we are too dependent on Russia, we are too dependent on the United States as a security provider, and that also leads to a different thinking about what about the dependencies towards China. So that's a different debate, and China can massively influence the debate to the better by actions and not necessarily by talking and symbolic actions. In the end, it's a question of how do European companies get access to Chinese markets? And will there be a flooding of overly subsidized products on the European market that on the one hand are warmly welcome to organize the transition, but on the other hand, it could also ruin the solar industry or the wind industry, and that will cause counter effects from the European Union.
Okay. Mr. Rong also once again very briefly responded to your German colleague.
Yeah, that's I think, great point that have been raised. Certainly, I think China has different views about that. But the very fact that I think the two sides all agree or understand the need for have effective communication, effective conversation like that is now even more needed, because the world is changing and both of us, all of us are changing. So this is the right time to have high quality conversations based on mutual respect and for the purpose of mutual understanding. Next year, China and Europe is going to celebrate the 50th anniversary of the established relationship. So this is a high time we start conversation like that.
Rong Ying, Joab Talker, last but not least, Ulrich Bruckner. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for joining us. Really appreciate it in your participation of this discussion. And that's all the time we have for today. If you'd like to know more, search World Insight. Check out our YouTube channel. Follow us on X and Facebook. I'm Tian Wei. On behalf of my team, thanks for being with us.